As expected, Russia has vetoed the vote of the United Nations Security Council, a vote at which India and China abstained. Will Vladimir Putin get away with his audacious invasion of Ukraine? I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. These are the developments on this big, breaking, developing global crisis at this hour. India and China were the two countries that abstained at the vote at the United Nations Security Council on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia, as expected, asserted its veto. Can the United Nations General Assembly still intervene? India is calling for de-escalation as Prime Minister Modi and Vladimir Putin have, of course, spoken directly. Ukraine and many in America say they're disappointed with the Indian position. Should India have taken a much stronger stand, as some have argued? Is India missing its moment in history? That's the question we can now put to Ambassador Pankaj Saran. Ambassador Saran is one of our senior most diplomats. He has served as the Deputy National Security Advisor as well as India's ambassador to Russia. Welcome to the program, Ambassador. I guess the abstention was as expected. We will play out in a moment India's reasoning for it, but let me first get your impressions. Do you agree with India's decision to abstain at the UN?
Yeah, thank you very much, firstly, for inviting me to your show. I don't think there are any surprises in the way India has voted. In fact, anything else would actually have been probably more surprising than this. And the reasons for this we can discuss as we go along. But to me, the bigger surprise is the abstention by China because it was felt that given the kind of relationship between the two of them, China would have supported Russia. But insofar as we are concerned, I think this is a good decision to take, predictable, few surprises, and the vote combined with the explanation of vote gives a package where you balance your national interests and broader interests with your principles. So it's a classical case of a balanced approach, and this is followed by every country. Now, it's coincidental that India happened to be a member of the Security Council this year. So the responsibilities on us and the spotlight on us was much more. And I think we have acquitted ourselves fairly well so far.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, we do need to talk separately about China's intriguing abstention, but let's first talk a little bit about what India did, a move that you described as well balanced, as rooted in practicality, guided by national self-interest, but also calling for a de-escalation of tensions. Others, including some diplomats, have called this anodyne, far too safe, not taking a principled position. And I want to ask you about all of that. But first, let's listen in to India's explanation of why we did abstain and go in the direction that we did.
Sure.
Mr. President, India is deeply disturbed by the recent turn of developments in Ukraine. We urge that all efforts are made for the immediate cessation of violence and hostilities. No solution can ever be arrived at the cost of human lives. We are also deeply concerned about the welfare and security of the Indian community, including a large number of Indian students in Ukraine. The contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. All member states need to honor these principles in finding a constructive way forward. Dialogue is the only answer to settling differences and disputes, however daunting that may appear at this moment. It is a matter of regret that the path of diplomacy was given up. We must return to it. For all these reasons, India has chosen to abstain on this resolution. I thank you.
Ambassador Saran, there are those, including some of your own colleagues in your fraternity, who believe that there could have been a bigger opportunity for India here to assert a mediatory role, a leadership role, that India has been far too anodyne, far too cautious. And actually, the only country, for example, in the Quad to have stopped short of condemnation. In fact, it's been pointed out that the word used in the initial statements of the foreign ministry did not even call the Russian invasion an invasion, instead using the word violence.
Yeah, you know, what you are saying is correct, but there is perhaps a different perspective to this whole thing. This is not a beauty contest where I have to appear pretty and I have to, take this crisis as an opportunity to ingratiate myself with external powers. As a responsible nation, as a country which faces very serious challenges of security, both domestic and external, and in our immediate neighborhood, the governance and the preservation of India's security has to be the topmost priority. And any decision or any posture that any government in India will take has to pass that litmus test of whether, number one, the decision I take is advancing my security. Number two, am I creating any precedent setting qualities in the decision I make? Number three, how would my adversaries interpret my decision? And number four, am I also in this process not egregiously violating international principles and the role of India as a global good for the world community? We have to have a good self perception about ourselves. A country of 1.3 billion people has, by definition, to play a certain role in global affairs, in domestic affairs. And whatever we do and whatever happens within India, in our region, has a global impact. So I agree that our approach is different from, say, the rest of the Quad. But the fact is, we are a member of the Quad. So it depends how you perceive and how you project the same reality. You are wanting a greater degree of ambition when it comes to the Quad, whereas the Indian thought process is that the fact that we are a member of the Quad by itself is a leap of faith from where we were several years
Sure.
ago. So these are all relative issues. Now, insofar as those countries or powers who were not happy with our vote, frankly, I am quite sure that they did not expect any other kind of vote from India. And it's also quite natural for the two sides to the conflict to exert maximum diplomatic pressure on India to side with them. And this is what international relations are all about. So, no surprises here also.
I hear you when you say this is not a beauty pageant, and India obviously cannot be guided by sentimentalism or the need for approval or scoring brownie points. But when you have somebody, for example, like Richard Haass, who leads the Council on Foreign Relations, as you know, he had quite a provocative tweet out in the last few hours that we can, in fact, bring up, where he spoke about India's careful avoid angering Putin at all cost response, despite Russia's blatant aggression, is disappointing as well as short-sighted given the rise of China. Of course, as it ended up, China also ended up abstaining, and I do still want to talk about that separately. But when you see a Richard Haass, a very influential voice, for example, in the Western foreign policy circles, he's no lightweight. What would you say to Richard Haass?
I would just basically say to him that for me, I'm really troubled because the same four or five, the concert of nations who were the victors of the Second World War, seem to, even today, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, which they won hands down and handsomely, are still dealing with the same issues about European security, about transatlantic security, about how to coexist with Russia. Now, if you yourself, as Richard Haass said, recognizes that in the 30 years that we have seen since 1991, the world has changed and is changing rapidly, then I would like to work with the Americans to then address the challenge which is going to come with much greater force for me and I presume for the Western Alliance in the future. The whole Ukrainian and what has happened and what we have seen brings us all back to ground zero in the sense that we are once again back to the same issues that have plagued the post World War II order, where Europe was the cockpit of international stability. We all know that the center of gravity has shifted away from Europe and it is somewhere else. Now, yes, I concede that the United States, being a global power, has the capability, military and otherwise, to take on both Russia and China. But I may not have that capability today. And therefore, whatever I do, as I mentioned to you, I have to ask myself, is it going to tomorrow, if I face a situation, how will it impact me? And what will be the precedent setting qualities insofar as my own challenges within my own immediate neighborhood is concerned and in the broader Indo Pacific region? I also have to then keep in mind the fact that over the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the relationship between India and the United States has grown also exponentially beyond expectation. But at the same time, my relationship with the Europeans has grown and it has also grown with the Russians. We are in a different place today. Now, of course, there would be disappointment. But, as I said, it's not a black and white. It's not so simple.
Ambassador Vivek Karju on this program yesterday called it a set of cruel dilemmas. He said India was grappling with a set of cruel dilemmas. Do you see the dilemmas as cruel, or do you actually also think that the Western nations are guilty of a certain degree of hypocrisy here? The Biden administration has clearly decided that other countries' wars are not worth fighting for. There are people who would point to the invasion of Iraq as one where the Americans claimed sort of a moral argument. And so, it suddenly becomes quite complex what to describe as an invasion and what not to call an invasion.
Yeah, I mean, in such situations where there are bipolarities, as we have seen in the case of the West versus Russia, there is no meeting ground. There is no middle ground. You have these, so it's always good to study the thought process and the thesis of your opponent to understand what his mindset is, what where he is coming from, how he has rationalized his actions. And if we are outside of this bipolarity, it becomes even more incumbent for us to then closely look at and study both sides of the fault line. So when you talk about hypocrisy or when you talk about precedent, it is absolutely clear that what we are witnessing today is not the first such event of unilateral action taken by a major military and world power against someone else. We have a litany of such actions in the past, and at every single stage, India has been forced, naturally, because we are part of the community, to take a stand. So we have to then be honest to ourselves and say, are some wars justified? Are other wars not justified? What is in it for me? If you launch an attack or a military operation to wipe out terrorism, to wipe out Islamic fundamentalism or any other threat that you see, or if you want to launch a military operation to engineer a regime change inside a country, if you want to proceed down the path of, say, the Arab Spring or a series of color revolutions. So, who is the judge in this whole apparatus who will then pronounce that this was right and this was wrong?
I do hear you, but none of this has actually happened in this context. For Putin to actually argue that Ukraine didn't exist and it's been cobbled together by the Russians is really, to borrow a phrase from Trump, post-truth. So that has not happened here, right? We know that.
No, that is may not have happened. But what I'm saying is, I'm making a slightly different point.
I know, I
That
get what you're saying. That one person's just what is another person's ingression. I hear you, but on a case to case basis, how do you see this particular invasion? I'm using the word invasion. You may not. This particular action by Putin in Ukraine.
no, obviously it's unfortunate, and in my opinion, and I'm not a spokesman for anyone except for my country. Uh, there seems to be a case where he has been pushed to the wall. And the reason I say that is because from everything I'm reading between the lines, from the responses and the positions of the NATO and the European Union, the fact that they have so far limited their response to a non military response, tailoring the response through the imposition of sanctions, and also making it very clear that US troops will not fight on Ukrainian territory, and that the only military action which the NATO alliance is ready to take so far is only on NATO territory, to me suggests that there is somewhere a deep realization and some kind of a policy taken that let us not take the next level of escalation based on this invasion. Otherwise, I really do not see why the NATO, which is a military alliance, or the European Union, could not have said, okay, now we will either go for a military response on Ukrainian territory, or even, for example, a resolution in the United Nations which falls under Chapter 7. So none of this has been done. What we have seen, so what does this suggest? This suggests that there is, even on the other side, there seems to be, in the policy making circles, I'm not talking about the commentariat in the West or in the United States, but in the circles that matter and take the decisions, it seems that they want to be proportionate and they want to do it one step at a time. And uh, the expectation is that this particular military operation should be contained by Russia themselves. Because if this spills over and goes beyond the southeastern portions of Ukraine, or goes beyond even, for example, into attacks on civilian and other locations within the rest of Ukraine, then obviously we are in a very serious situation. And since Europe has experienced not of one but of two world wars, they have unfortunately been both the perpetrators and the victims of wars in which millions and millions of people have lost. They know the stakes better than us.
I hear you. And when you speak about Putin being pushed to the wall, there was a reflection of some of that in the Chinese statement as well. China's surprising abstention, but an underlining that Moscow's security concerns were legitimate. Would you go so far as to say that they're legitimate? That in a way, the sort of NATO's push has brought this crisis? Do you blame NATO for this? Where do you apportion blame and responsibility for what has happened?
I think there are many commentators in the NATO alliance who actually make the same point as the Chinese do. And they say that this whole story began at least since 2014, if not earlier. And even today, even yesterday, there have been some exchanges of statements between the Ukrainians and the Russians where they are talking of security guarantees. Now, the question of ensuring legitimate security requirements and needs of both Russia and Ukraine remains very much on the table. The question is, how do you, because neither of them is going away. Ukraine is not disappearing from Europe, nor is Russia. They're going to live today and in perpetuity. Uh, so, how do you handle and how do you arrive at a consensus where the legitimate security interests of both? So, they tried in Minsk in 2014, in 2015. France and Germany were sitting on the table with these two republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. The leaders of these republics were on the table. The OSCE was there. So all the actors were there. And we were all happy that, you have found the willingness and the ability to sit across the table and find a mutually acceptable compact which takes into account traditional concepts of security. It's not as if the Ukrainian military is bombarding Russia. It's not as if there is a conventional classical military conflict. The uncertainties and the insecurities are arising from many other things, not least of which is the whole problem of identity, of cultural ethnicity, of religion, etc. And I dare say that for countries which are successors to empires which have been defeated or which have been vanquished, and where the division has not been perfect, we can readily associate ourselves with this kind of thing. So, in some senses, you can even consider this as the unfinished agenda of the breakup of the Soviet Union, which is still playing out 30 years after the event.
A very sentimental senior Ukrainian diplomat in an interview to me minutes ago said that this is a choice between good and evil, that he was disappointed with India and that India was in danger of selling its soul. There are Indian diplomats who are saying that we cannot behave from the inertia of a Cold War past, and that the arc of India from being non-aligned has moved to a country that is now in the Quad, attends democracy summits, and so on. Now, I know you might say that the Ukrainian diplomat is speaking from his self-interest, and an Indian diplomat must speak from her or his self-interest. But what do you say to those who keep urging India to take a position on principle and not realpolitik?
A lot of this is opportunistic. Sometimes we are told to follow principles, sometimes we are told to follow interests. As India becomes bigger in terms of its national power, we will rub against established, emerging, declining powers, and we just have to be thick skinned. I don't see any other way. We were not in this position in the early 50s. We were much, much more vulnerable. Today, as you aspire to expand the boundaries of your power, both internally and externally, you also have to be ready to take the flak for whatever decisions you take. But as long as you are internally and intellectually satisfied that the decision you have taken is in the circumstances and given the constraints that you face, the right decision, I will live with it. I don't want to overreach. I do not want to be moralistic, but I just want to say, can what I'm doing, does it help me? And of course, I also know in the process that I will anger people. Uh, I will live with it. Because if I swing to the other side and take a more, let us say, idealistic position or a moralistic position, yes, there may be occasions when, for me, certain principles. So I would like you to show me the principles first, because, and then I will give you an answer. So we can go on this issue.
Fair enough. I hear absolutely what you're saying, but can we talk in the final minutes of this interview about what possible consequences there could be for which direction in the world power could pivot? Now, if we come out of these pictures and we show our audience who was describing the situation as exciting when he touched down in Moscow, I'm of course talking about Imran Khan. Now, we can't overlook the fact that Pakistan's Prime Minister was actually on camera as the plane touched down, telling the people escorting him, the Russian diplomats, what an exciting time to be here, which seemed, of course, facile and jarring, but these pictures are telling. This is all happening in the middle of this crisis. There was also the fear of a Russia-China axis, which makes China's abstention very, very intriguing. Are you actually seeing in the consequences of Putin's military assault of Ukraine the rearrangement of a global order?
Yeah, very interesting. When you talk about Pakistan, I love the Pakistanis. I mean, when you talk about Pakistan, someone could accuse you and me of being as obsessed with Pakistan as Russia is with Ukraine. That said, and there are reasons, of course, why there is some truth in both these, in this comparison. But frankly, the as I have said earlier, Pakistan is not so much a kind of a determiner or a creator of a certain world order as it is a pawn in a bigger game. And this.
No, I just want to clarify that obviously Pakistan is almost like a vassal state. The determiners are countries like Russia and China. And I was just intrigued to hear your response on what you think the axis or the new axis of Bush used to call it evil, but the new axis of power could emerge from this conflict.
Yeah, I think the fact of a phone call between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi on the day when Imran Khan was in Moscow speaks 1,000 words. This is not normally done. I mean, in the morning you meet him, and then in the evening you make a phone call. Now, I don't know what transpired in the phone call, but the very fact that it took place, I think, says a lot. And with regard to the axis and to the Russia-China relationship is a subject worthy of a full discussion. It is very layered. It has many different hues and complexions. At a simple level, I can say, firstly, that the United States defense strategy and the security strategy painted both countries in the same brush. So you have an automaticity about a Russia-China grouping flowing from what the United States said. You also have a reality where you have a huge amount of trade, which is extremely distorted, and it does not give much credit to Russia if you look at the composition and the trade balance. You also know that where Russia stagnated or declined, in the same period, China flew into being what it is today. So, thirdly, the relationship that China has with Europe is quite different from the relationship that Russia has with Europe. So, in this particular crisis, the dynamics between Russia and China are rather different. I mean, there are European countries who have signed on to the BRI. There are countries like Germany whose economic prosperity depends on China. So we have situations where Russia and China have actually very different interests in Europe. So it's layered, and it's more complicated than it appears. But yes, I do agree that for various reasons, there is a convergence of Russian and Chinese interests. But having said that, there are issues, and what we as India would like to do is we would like to focus our energies on dealing with someone who's on the border. We do not have Russia on our border, but we certainly have China on our border. And we have a China which is highly militaristic, expansionist, and we have to deal with that.
Absolutely. Finally, Ambassador Saran, are you at all hopeful that this could be, as you said, contained at the level of Russia itself, that this is not something that is going to spill over and become, as many loosely online call it, World War III?
If we were to assume, it's a big assumption, but there is a track record that there is rationality in the Russian decision, and there is no suicidal intent, then I would say yes, it can be contained, because I draw optimism from the fact, as I mentioned to you, about the nature and the proportionality of the Western response. Nothing stopped them from jumping into Ukraine, sending soldiers, sending the armies, all that they're doing today is sending weapons. Now, we know the capabilities of the Ukrainian military. They're very humble and modest. So I feel that unless something really dramatic happens and unforeseen, and there is some major accident, hopefully we should be able to contain it.
Well, I hope you're right. I think for the sake of the world, no one wants another war, no matter which way you fall on and which side you fall on this debate. Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Learned a lot. Pleasure having you, and hope to reconnect with you as we watch this space and this developing story carefully. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.